Hello.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for joining today, everybody. We appreciate your time. Thank you to O'Reilly for inviting us to this webcast today. And we're delighted today to talk to you about APIs and how you can use them to transform your business. First, we will introduce ourselves here. I'd like to start by...
I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Greg Brail. I'm the CTO for Apigee, one of the co-authors of the book. I'm really happy to be here with Dan and Daniel, but I'm also really happy to be here with Scott, because without Scott there wouldn't have been a book.
Okay.
So it's really great to have him here as well.
Yeah, my name is Dan Jacobson. I'll echo Greg's sentiment that Scott was critical in this, and thanks a lot for all the effort on that. I head up the Netflix API and was also a co-author on the book.
Yeah, we'd also like to introduce our friend and colleague Dan Woods, who couldn't be here today. Dan is the CEO of Evolve Media, and he's an entrepreneur and a writer for Forbes and a bunch of other really cool stuff. So thanks to Dan, and especially to everybody today for joining. Just really quickly, our webcast today, we're going to highlight some of the key points, maybe the key point from our book, APIs, a Strategy Guide. It's a pretty fast read, but it might be helpful to talk about the purpose of the book and especially who the book is for. Greg,
okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, why don't I start with the purpose of the book? Clearly, there's been a huge amount of interest in APIs over the last few years. We're seeing tons of that at Apigee. Netflix is one of the star examples, and there are plenty of other companies who have transformed their business or are transforming their business via APIs. And one of the things we observed as we were getting ready to write this book is that there are some technical books out there about things like web services and REST and OAuth and you name it. There wasn't really a book that talked about kind of the why. Why do I need an API? How will an API help my business? How will I engage developers with my API? And also a lot of this material and a lot of these books are all about the open public APIs like Twitter and Facebook and Google Maps and Yahoo Maps and some of the others that have been around for, in some cases, quite a few years. And that's what we think of when we think of APIs. What we've noticed at Apigee is that many of our customers who have the largest amount of API traffic and who are seeing APIs having the biggest impact on their business are having those APIs be used by internal developers, by partners, by key customers, by all kinds of people other than, hey, let's put an API on the internet and hope developers will build apps for it, which is a very valid strategy for some companies. But the real exciting business transformation is taking place, under the iceberg of some of these APIs that are being used privately.
And I'll piggyback on that and pick up where you left off on the iceberg analogy. In essence, we've called this webinar Under the Iceberg because we think about the iceberg as a small percentage of what you see above the water. A small percentage of the iceberg is above, but the large mass underneath is not visible, but the biggest portion of it. When we think about the business proposition going forward for APIs, most of us do see all the APIs that are highly visible, the public portion of it. But as Greg was mentioning, the big impact for companies is going to be that big mass under the water.
Absolutely.
And so, as Greg mentioned, we do spend a bunch of time in the book talking about the various audiences and understanding who your audiences will be when designing the API and then designing it accordingly. And we think that there's a large movement going forward towards the mass under the water.
Absolutely.
Right on. So for today, for this time, we thought we'd hit these topics just quickly. What is an API? Not just a technical definition, but business definition as well. And why does it matter? How can it impact your business? Love to engage these two guys here in a discussion about what's different, what's the same between public and private APIs. Ton of experience here on both sides of me. And just hit some highlight business, big animal questions in the topics of, always comes up. Design, how to run a channel, technology roadmap, marketing, and then we are anxiously monitoring your questions as well. So we've got a ton of stuff here, but if we can't cover it all, we'd love to focus on as many questions as come up as well. Cool. So listen, just to tee this up for very, very quickly, as Dan and Greg said, you may or may not be familiar with a lot of these really maybe highly visible, is a good way to say it, examples. I mean, these players here are leaders in building businesses, huge results, the underpinning of which is a big part of it's an API. Salesforce, leader for many, many years. Amazon, serving more bandwidth on AWS than all their websites combined, which is crazy. Twitter is an entirely API-based business. And then, Dan, some of these numbers here for Netflix just seem just 30% of primetime traffic. Still the case?
As far as I'm aware, I don't actually track that number, but that is what people say.
Wow. Okay. And then NPR as well. Basically, all their distribution. You ran that program as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this is interesting because some of these, like, we'll talk in detail about the Netflix and NPR use cases. But even if you think about Twitter, you and I think about Twitter as a public open API anyone can build an app for. But Twitter, they actually do have revenue. And one of the ways they make revenue is by selling access to high-quality streams and analytics and high-value streaming for a fee. And one of the ways they do that is through an API. Mm-hmm. So even Twitter, who's probably, along with Facebook, the most popular example of an open public API, also has a private API business. Mm-hmm. And that's something, to keep in mind. Amazon, obviously, it's public and open. Anyone can use it, but, we all pay Amazon. Salesforce, this is Salesforce customers using it, and this is Salesforce partners using it, and I know that they enabled integration with the Salesforce platform as well as, hey, let's just build an app on Salesforce. So, all of these things become a mix of private and public, but when you really look at it, there's an awful lot of API usage that's more than, hey, anybody can build an app kind of stuff.
Yeah, and with respect to the public-private API, that discussion, both Netflix and NPR, which are two programs that I've run, the overwhelming use case for both of those companies has been in the private internal use cases. In both cases, well over 90% of the consumption is in the private case.
Now you may say, hey, listen, this is really interesting, but my company may not be a web company, or what's the relevant? Is this relevant to everybody? And before thinking about that question a bit, this is the big, at least in I think my view, the big market transition that's driving a lot of what we've seen in the market, which is everybody needs an app.
Yeah.
And I think these analysts are falling over each other to estimate just how big this could be. But we hear numbers like a world where we're transitioning from 1 billion browsers to 20 billion, I think I've seen 500 billion,
yeah.
So 500 billion, a trillion mobile clients or apps, but there's just a huge, big market changes that's happening here.
Yeah, I mean, we're already at a point in the most economically successful companies, I don't know the right term to use, where there are more cell phones than people.
Yeah.
Now, not all of those are smartphones, but we know that smartphone penetration, it's not just in Silicon Valley. You can go anywhere in the United States or Europe. You can go to India, and you'll see more and more people using smartphones. I think we're very quickly reaching the point where the number of API clients will, in many countries, exceed the number of people. And that, so, there's kind of a funny backdoor way that people get an API, which is CIO, CEO says, where's our mobile app?
Uh-huh.
They have to build a mobile app. They hire some developers. They build a mobile app on iOS. Then they realize they also need it on Android. Then they realize they need an iPad version. Then maybe they have a BlackBerry or a Windows phone or something. And before they know it, they say, gee, can't the back end of all of these different apps be driven by one consistent set of services? And, we should really design those services in a way so developers can come onto our platform and very easily build new apps for new devices or new platforms. And maybe we also need a web app and a server-side app and partner integration. And before you know it, you need an API. You may not have started off saying we need an API and waving the API flag. You may have started off saying CIO wants an iPad app. Where's the iPad app? And once you play out that logical series of conclusions, the need to have sort of a consistent interface that all of these apps can use becomes very critical. And hey, you need an API.
Yeah, and once you hit the inflection point of having that API, that's when it hockey sticks up. And using Netflix as an example, we originally started with the API being exclusively a public API. Over time, switched that over to get devices on top of it. And then once we changed the strategy, it really took off, and now we're at the point of over 800 plus device types running off of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's that API that enables that mass distribution of the content and economy of scale when you're developing on multiple devices.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. 800 devices. I mean, that's a great business context, which is, if you're running a business and you have a channel to reach customers, the urgency here is that your customers are quickly moving to all of these different places, and your job is to be there.
Yeah.
And one of our colleagues has a great way of saying is their context in which they expect your service to be available to them is changing. I think for me, it's like if I'm on a music app, if I can't buy that tune that I'm listening to on Amazon or iTunes or put it on my Spotify, I'm really disappointed. And I think all of us that have data or run services need to think about being where the customers are going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think my brother-in-law started counting the number of devices in his house that can receive Netflix, and I mean, it's like, he ran out of fingers, the phones, the iPad, the Xbox, the PlayStation, the TV, the stereo receiver, the computer. Yeah, maybe not everybody needs to be on that many devices, but it's not just devices, it's also, server-to-server access, partner access, integration access for people writing scripts to drive your platforms. One of the things we're working on is a new generation of our API platform. And how do you deploy to this? Well, you use an API. I mean, it may be blindingly obvious, but if you're going to have a service that's used by 800 different device types, you don't want all 800 different developer teams starting from scratch on, give me a copy of the database schema, or, give me a copy of the WSDL so I can start hacking away at the SOAP that underlies my thing. Yeah. You want to say, you want to use our API? Here's the website with the docs. Here's how you sign up to get access. Here's how we make sure that in your testing phase you don't screw up the production system. Yep. Here's how we make sure once you're in production that your API usage doesn't screw up the other 799 devices. All those requirements are, critically important.
Yeah, and it's not just the device opportunity that we're talking about here. There's also just general internal efficiency that you can gain. So, for example, at NPR, when we first employed the API, one of the first things that we did is we got the website on top of it, and that created this efficiency between the presentation layer and the back end, so that you can kind of parse out the problem set and have both teams operating in parallel, and it just operating a website on top of an API layer. That abstraction gives you a lot more opportunity. Absolutely. So it's not just about device penetration, although that's a huge opportunity. You're just going to get better at developing the internal stuff as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also partner penetration. I mean, I can't use Twitter as the only example, but, look at what they've done. You can tweet from anything. I can't quite tweet from my car, except if I use my phone, but I'm actually kind of surprised about that. I mean, I'm getting tired of, I think my stereo receiver lets me tweet.
We don't want you to tweet.
I don't know why I don't want to tweet from my stereo receiver, but you can, and, hey, this is a huge opportunity, for partner integration, for brand penetration. I mean, there's a whole huge opportunity there that that can be seen.
Okay, look out for Greg on the roads.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be tweeting from
Let's take a step back here. Just if you're new to this space, coming at it from the business angle, guys, how do you always the topic of it's tough to nail down, but how do we define an API?
Okay. Can I start, and then I'll let
you
go for it. So I see it as two things. The first part is that it's a contract. It's very important that this is a contract between the team that produces the API and the developers who use the API. That contract specifies things like how much you're allowed to use the API and what you're allowed to use it for, but on one end. On the other end, the person providing the API specifies, here's the interface I'm going to provide, here's the kind of SLA I'm going to provide, here's what I'm going to say about how often it's going to change, so that you don't have to rewrite your apps whenever it changes. So there's the contract part, and I think the idea of the API being a contract is critically important. If I build an Android app in my basement, I don't have a basement anymore. I live in California, but in my office, and I just have a web service on the other end that uses JSON, that doesn't necessarily make it an API. But if I wrap it in some docs in a contract and set it up so other people can use it, or even if I can use it for 2 projects and I have a little contract with myself, now it's turning into an API. The other part of it, and we won't talk a lot about technology today, we have lots of other great technology webinars that we do in this room, but I think APIs tend to use a consistent set of technology that we kind of call API technology. They almost always use HTTP or HTTPS. They use either JSON or XML or both, with the trend flipping towards JSON. They tend to use OAuth. And sort of this trio of sort of HTTP plus JSON plus OAuth becomes kind of the API technology stack that is, a lot more, it's different from previous generations of technology stacks in that there's not as much stuff required on either end to use it. A lot of APIs can be used in a meaningful way from a command line, which is great for scripting. It's great for development. A lot of API calls you can look at in a tool like the Apigee console or using a TCP dump or something like that and actually see what's going between the client and server and understand it. And that eases development, and that's one of the primary goals of an API program, in my opinion.
Okay, so I'm going to chime in and cut a little bit against.
And you're going to tell me that you're moving away from OAuth.
So generally speaking, I agree with everything that Greg said for most cases. And starting with the contract, that is absolutely the case. So an API really is a contract at the core. In terms of the technology stack and the way that you want to go about that contract, I believe that it starts with figuring out who your audience is.
Absolutely.
So I keep talking about that because I think it's really important. And so for Netflix, as an example, most of our traffic's coming from these streaming devices. That's going to change the way that we're going to think about the API. That audience is going to have different needs, and the contract might look a lot different than the contract with a public API.
Yeah.
And just piggybacking on that, the way that Netflix is basically moving is, we are getting a little bit away from OAuth. We're thinking less about, RESTful type protocols, because when we hit that key point of 800 plus device types, the challenges are very different at that scale than you would have at, a dozen, or, I have an iPhone, I'm thinking about an Android and an iPad.
Yeah.
And so because of the scale and the reach of all that, which translates into who my audience is, you got to think about things a little bit differently potentially. So at the core, I agree with what you're saying, but there are different challenges, and you always need to be sensitive about how you need to adjust your particular strategy to create the right contract.
Right.
Yeah. I'd add to the definition topic, a good simple way to talk about APIs is it's just a way to get your data to partners and on apps. And there was a question that was asked about from Kojo saying, hey, API seems like a great choice for service-based sites, but what about traditional content-focused sites? And API is a great choice to get your content to partners. I think about companies that have catalogs like a Sears. Or
RSS was one of the original APIs.
RSS,
right?
yeah, absolutely. Or Financial Times and financial data. It's just a way to, I think part of the magic of an API is that self-service. Here's my data, come and get it.
But I think there's some very particular aspects of managing a data API that I think Daniel can talk about things like rights management and stuff like that. That, I'm a technology guy. I tend to not be as experienced with that, and I think that both at NPR and at Netflix, that's a huge part of what you do that I think is specific to a data API. So I don't know if we got a page on that coming up, but we should.
Do we?
We don't.
We have a chapter in the book about it.
We have a chapter in the book about that, but it might be worth talking about that for a few seconds.
So with respect to the content-based sites, I mean, NPR I would consider in that category, and we put a huge emphasis on our strategy at the time, which was COPE, create once, publish everywhere. And that was really creating an abstraction between capturing the data and presenting the data. And then the layer in between was an API. And then basically sitting on top of that API is just a whole suite of different presentation layers. It might end up being the website. It might end up being an iPad or an iPhone or whatever else. But the key is when you have a content-based operation like an NPR, which has a lot of text and images and things like that, in addition to the audio, you got to think about it in terms of capturing it, distributing it, presenting it, which I think NPR was very effective at. So I think for those types of operations, an API should be at the core of what you're thinking about moving forward.
Yeah. API is a great way to enforce terms versus RSS feed, or if your site's getting scraped. That's a very frequent
Well, yeah, that's, how do you know when you need an API? And I think we actually had a blog on this years ago, which is, I've talked to a lot of customers who said, we've got this great interactive, highly interactive AJAX-based website, and people figured out that they could, look at the HTML and figure out what JSON calls we were making to the back end, and they built their own apps on top of it, and now they're using our brand in a funny way. So, there's a great way to know that you need an API. Launch an API, find the people who built those apps, don't hit them over the head with your legal department, but invite them to your offices and make them your biggest fan, and make them customer number one of your API program.
Yeah, another point on that is that if people are scraping your site, there is no rights management on that. They're just taking anything that you're presenting.
And they're probably using your logo in a way that your legal department will have conditions about.
So if you're presenting an AP photo that you have rights to present on your site but not rights to redistribute, the scraping is actually potential breach. If you're doing it through the API, you can create all kinds of layers within your system to withhold certain material from certain audiences, so that if they want to get that data through an API, it's there, but you're a certain user type, so we're not going to give you the AP photo, and we're going to protect ourselves. And if people are misusing it, you have the option of shutting down, where it's not quite as easy. You can do IP detection and shutting down IPs,
but better to say, hey, shut off API access to this photo, or shut it off to the following apps identified by an application key or something.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one recourse. Although I would say that generally at NPR and at Netflix, if people are doing things that you don't want them to do, they've engaged with your company, they've engaged with your API, they want to be agreeable, and so it's really an easy conversation to say, you're pulling down these AP photos, that's not good, can you stop doing this or stop doing that? And they're very willing in most cases to accommodate, and if not, then you can shut them down.
Right, your first reaction is not to stick the lawyers on them. Right.
Okay, Netflix, you guys do a great job of enforcing consistency in your brand across all those hundreds of devices. And I think that's how you guys do that is a great topic. Hey, a good segue here, though, which is your story about tapping into the back end of your website, and I think that's how Google Maps API got started. And
didn't some guy reverse engineer the JavaScript?
Yeah,
and they said, we need an API.
Chicago Maps mashups, and that was back in 2005-ish probably. And you can see here, this is courtesy of our friend John Musser, Programmable Web, which is an amazing resource for learning about APIs. But you can see that the trajectory of, again, public APIs. And you hear this number cited all the time. There's 4,000 public APIs, but again, what we really want to talk about is, or really get deeper into, is something that we want to hear more about in the industry discussion, which is what kind of value can you create with your partners and inside your company with APIs that are private. So just one more time, how do we define? I know we just hashed over this a long time for the book. So how do we settle on the definition of a private API versus public?
Yeah, because we originally had three.
That's
we had public, private, and partner.
That's
and every section of the book had to have three parts to it, and we all got a little crazy, right? And we said, you know what, there's public and private. So in my opinion, public is any developer can sign up and build an app.
Okay.
And private is not that. Is it that simple? Or?
So I would go a little further and say basically the distinction is the nature of the relationship between the API provider and the consumer. And if the consumer does not have a tight relationship, is kind of somewhere else and doesn't have a contract or something like that, that's public. If you're engaged in a contract or some sort of relationship, very tight relationship, I would consider that internal. And so an example of that is, at NPR, there's the NPR Addict iPhone app. That's public. Somebody out there just kind of randomly built this, And there are a lot of those apps for Netflix, the Q readers and FeedFlix and Instant Watcher and whoever else. But if you go to those 800 devices that can stream a Netflix experience, those are internal development. Some of those are actually engaging with partners who are, who actually build it or we collaborate with. And a lot of that actually is internal development teams who are building out those UIs for those devices. So the latter case, I consider all that internally.
Yeah, and I think in our taxology, those are all private APIs.
Yeah.
And I think we actually go in the book in some detail about the different types of public and private APIs. So, for instance, a lot of companies have APIs that are for their customers, maybe only for their key customers. There are a lot of customers in the email marketing space, for instance, a fairly new industry that didn't exist 10 years ago. Well, in order to use this thing, you've got to upload information about your marketing campaign and start it and stop it and get analytics. Well, you do that using an API. I consider that a private API. It's not for just anyone in the world to use, right? On the other hand, there's purely internal use. The FX department wants to use an API that was built by the Treasury Department, or the global marketing department wants to build an API that was used by the whatever server engineering department. I think that's also a growing use of APIs. I think if we look at what happened with SOA, a lot of emphasis on building web services inside the organization, but using a technology stack that was very complicated.
What's SOA for business people?
Service-oriented architecture. It was all the rage a couple of years ago, right? People spent millions and millions of dollars on this, more than that actually. But it was about building services within the organization and kind of protecting them through a governance layer so no one screwed them up. And the idea was that eventually we'll get some reuse. Well, I think APIs are a better way to do that. Okay, here's an easy-to-use way to get a reusable service that 5 departments in my company need to use. There's a contract. There's a way to regulate access to it. It's easy for developers to adopt. Please use it. And by the way, anybody in the company can start using this thing and start building an app on it. Maybe they can't go in production, but they can try it out without having to attend the monthly meeting and get a building permit from the governance committee. So, I think this is just starting it. APIs for customers, APIs for partners, APIs for the third parties who you hire to build your apps. That's
when you guys,
that's huge.
I know I'm going to trip over my words here, but when you guys nailed this way of saying it when we were writing this book, which was that it's kind of ironic that in the past 5 years, in order to figure out how to do things efficiently inside our companies, we had to kind of look to this model that was developed and perfected and exploded out in doing these kind of fun consumer things outside of our companies. And we were applying that model of ease and simplicity and self-service inside.
Yeah, I would say that the way APIs took off was primarily on getting a lot of exposure. That highly visible part above the water gets people really excited. And when you get excited, you're thinking, wow, all these different people can build all kinds of amazing things for us. But then you start saying, why can't we be one of those people building one of those amazing things for us? And then you start internalizing it and about it differently.
You've got the consumerization of IT. You've almost got the consumerization of development. So you've got your corporate developer who goes home on the weekend and says, I want to build a Facebook app. And they go to the Facebook page and they just start building it and using the API. And they get to work on Monday and they say, I want to build an app that uses the service the other team built. And they say, why can't it be that easy?
Exactly. That's kind of a cool segue into the Netflix story, as you told it a few minutes ago. But if I recall, you started with this external. You started with something that was exposed externally and kind of brought it in.
That's right. And so in I think it was 2008, Netflix launched the public API. That was the only use of the API. And I would say 100% of the traffic was coming from third-party developers out there in the world, that public case. Sometime after that, I don't remember exactly when, started thinking about it as the streaming support system, or not for the actual streams, but for the metadata. And as I said before, it just started taking off. And one interesting data point for me, just kind of charting the impact for Netflix that the API has had, and the growth that it has enabled. I like to think of it in terms of this chart, but it doesn't tell the whole story. In January 2010, the Netflix API, which is by and large at that time an internal case, which also had some public traffic. That month we had about 600 million requests for the month.
600 million?
600 million. Fast forward to January 2011, we were at 21 billion, and fast forward January 2012, we're at 42 billion. And so that's a growth rate of more than 70 times over a 2-year span, and there's no sign of it slowing down. And when you think about the number of devices and the growth of users, it's really a scale problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there is that key aspect of API development. How do you build a scalable, resilient system that meets your SLAs and allows for this innovation? So at the time we were at 600 million requests in January 2010. We didn't have 800 devices, and we didn't have 20 plus million users. And over time, we've increased the number of users, we've increased the number of devices, we've created more engaging streaming apps that result in a higher and a richer experience for our users. So that's more API traffic, and our ability to scale it at that rate is a key point. And honestly, I think that the Netflix device penetration is actually a differentiating aspect of the company.
Absolutely. And
Can't get away from it. It's everywhere.
Well, listen, how was your experience at NPR different? Because you kind of have a similar graph here showing growth back in those days.
Yeah, so I was there at the inception, and I actually was a key driver in starting the API program. So I can talk specifically about how that ramped up. And as I said before, the original plan there was create this abstraction layer, enable us to decouple in a very meaningful way the presentation layer from the data capture. And so the first thing that we did was, we built this layer, we built an API, and then we refactored at least a portion of the NPR site on top of it, and that was the NPR Music site. Then we started to think about the API and say, well, what else can we do with this? And we were very keen to refactor the primary site on it as well, which we did.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started seeing other use cases popping up, like the NPR Addict iPhone app, which I mentioned before. And that really captured our imagination to think a little bit more about how can we leverage this ourselves. And we built iPhone apps and iPad apps, and there are several of these apps on each device now. NPR News, NPR Music. The content is now on Livio radios, so there's no visual component there, but the display of the metadata scrolls by, and we're distributing to all kinds of member stations. So it really became a core part of the strategy, and I would say that the content management system coupled with the API is kind of the centerpiece for what NPR has been able to do over the last bunch of years.
Cool. Hey, listen, I got a note from the audience that says don't be afraid to get into some of the tech details.
Okay.
We got to
make sure to spend some time.
No, we got some stuff that lends itself to that coming up. So you guys can bring it.
It's probably worth noting that we do talk about this type of stuff in the book as well.
Yeah, our technology chapters.
There are, but we also defer to some other books that go deeper on those categories. So the book, we think, is much more of a strategy guide with some key concepts around tech. But there are other resources out there that go much deeper than our book.
Right.
So with that, I'll skip past this, but we did a survey of our customers with Hurwitz, and bottom line is about 60% of our customers end up doing something that's partner-oriented. About 15% do something that's public-oriented, and the rest do something internal. And just further kind of reflecting that the meat of what we're seeing, big regular companies, is kind of skewed that way.
Okay.
But I'll keep moving here, and especially when I hear the NPR case study, to me, thinking about it from the business side, it's that you described it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as you were building out all of these channels and powering them with the API, and I guess one key point that we would have is that if you are a head of product management or the head of business, the general manager, a kind of good way to think about your API strategy is that this is like going from a direct channel to, like, here's my website, read it, to an indirect channel, analogous to other indirect channels in other industries, where, to me, like, the one thing that stands out is now you got to find and make delighted a channel partner. And like, who is your channel partner? It's developers, and they are the key for you to get your stuff out there.
Go ahead. I wanted to pick on one word you used there, which is developers, and we actually had interesting dialogues about that term as we were creating the book. Because my thought on it is developers, I like to think of it more as API consumers, because particularly with the internal case, it's not just developers, right? The guy in the shed or whatever else. They're product people. There's all kinds of other people that are engaged in creating rich experiences on top of your API. There are developers there. Obviously, you need to build apps, but most of what NPR does is focus on product and and have developers who actually execute on it.
Yeah, and so I think we meant the term developers to be fairly all. It's not just people who write code, but I understand what you mean. One of the things that is. I feel like we're making public APIs kind of a bummer in this whole presentation. I mean, clearly there have been some tremendously successful examples of public APIs. I think there are a lot of companies out there who aspire to have the star public API that takes their company into places where they never imagined it would go. Yeah. Just like, Netflix. Well, actually, Netflix did imagine streaming because it was named Netflix, but so maybe that's not a good example. But Twitter is one of the great examples. I don't know if Mark Zuckerberg imagined Farmville when he invented Facebook, right? So there's that, but I think the way you get there is by having those partners and those key developer relationships. Very, very, very few people succeed by just putting an API on the internet and blogging about it, and suddenly they have, thousands of developers building apps and they're making money. They start with individual partner relations. They start with marketing. They start with hackathons. They start with making relationships with individual groups of developers who build apps. Yeah, and then maybe they get famous.
Yeah. So for the public API case, and I agree. We are coming across as kind of slamming it.
I mean, it's all one big thing, right?
Yeah, and I think we all agree that there's definitely a value for public APIs in certain scenarios. I think what I would like to convey is that the private case or the internal case, we know that you will be able to succeed in getting value out of that case, right? Yeah. There are so many benefits to having this kind of abstraction layer in your device implementation, your internal efficiencies, your partner engagement. I mean, it's clear to us that in almost any scenario, you'll be able to get value. Yeah. The public case, you'll get maybe some incremental value. It's going to be high cost to engage in that way, and there's that opportunity for the big home run. But it's really hard to predict whether or not you'll be able to knock it out of the park, and so that's the distinction there.
Good strategy is to dial in your whole process, internal, private, and then by the time you go public, you're in good tune.
Right. Exactly.
And there's a question here, which is what is in an API platform? What's it need to have? And I think this slide is a good place to make a point that a platform is not, at least my humble opinion, not just about connecting the technology pieces, but it's also a people problem. And creating, connecting the different players, understanding what's happening through the channel, and it's also, I think the processes are as much a part of the product as the actual stack itself. Because if you don't have a lot of these processes dialed up and efficient, you're going to get it's going to be tough. Yeah. And so to me, the platform to answering that question from Raghu is not just the technology, which we'll get into, but also the tools and processes and such.
Yeah, and when I was standing up the NPR one, that API program, I basically engaged with, I think it was 5 or 6 distinct groups within the company, because it's not just about, do I need this gateway into the system, and what services do I need to provide, and is it going to be JSON or whatever else? Yeah. That was a small component, and that's one of those groups. It was a technical group, but I had to focus on what are the editorial considerations, what are the legal considerations, the business strategy, what does it mean for NPR, what does it mean for all the member stations, and so there are a whole bunch of things that go into this, and that is part of the overall program. And of course, you need to consider that technical part. Are you gonna, what are you gonna need in order to stand this up technically? And what's your key management and your security strategy? And those are all important things, and we do touch on a lot of that in the book. but that's a component among others.
Yeah. And it's interesting, every time I do something like this, there is a lot of demand to talk about that. And, this is API as a strategy guide. I think there seems to be a lot of demand. And some of this we've done in some previous webinars and blog entries, but I think we could just keep talking about it, especially as the technology changes. When we started talking about APIs a couple of years ago, it was, some APIs use XML, some APIs use JSON, know your audience. Yeah. Now it's like, APIs use JSON, unless you have a lot of Windows developers in your shop who love Visual Studio, in which case you should use XML. So, it's interesting to see, maybe some of the advice that we've been talking about for years it changes over the years.
Yeah. Hey, go ahead.
I wanted to go back to what you were talking about with channels, making sure that you can open up those channels. Yeah. I just wanted to say one quick thing about that is, you're going to have all these different channels that are opening up to you, and engagement with partners and different device implementations. But one of the things that the API really does is it creates abstraction between the execution and the channel development itself. And so, previously, without this kind of strategy, you'd probably need to have the tech team deeply entrenched in that integration with that channel. Yeah. But what this API does is it says, okay, here's the distribution pipe for this metadata, and whatever your back end is, PHP or Java or whatever else, that API is, you can kind of encapsulate those technical skills and that operation into that tier. And as your channel builds out whatever they want to do, if it's an Objective-C iPhone app or iPad app, you can apply those skills in that world and have those people develop against that. And so you're really separating out the skill sets and the charters, as opposed to having this big monolithic stack and having people who are generalists or whatever it is. You can get the most out of each of those areas.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, listen, I'm going to skip over this next slide because I think we hit a lot of it. Good opportunity to say that there's a URL for a free chapter of this book, which actually contains all of the stuff on this slide, some detailed explanation. I don't know if there's anything that we didn't hit here, but why do you need an API? You're getting scraped. Your competition has one. You want to enable partners. It's great when you show up at the BD meeting. They've already built something on your API, right? It makes it go really fast. You want to be on apps. But anyway, get that chapter for free. There's a URL for the PDF. You can check it out right now. Keep moving here. You want to keep moving or you want to?
Yeah, no, I think we've talked a lot about this right here.
Yeah.
We could probably move on.
All right, let's
move on.
Move on. Okay. So listen, let's get into some considerations for different parts of your strategy.
A short topic that, only kidding.
Yeah.
So look, and I think this is where, there are some differences between public and private, and I think the thing that the three of us all agree on, and that we say constantly, is that you have to know your audience, right? So if you're running a webinar for, developers in, the Silicon Valley area, you should probably run it on a platform that supports Chrome. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. But basically, it's something that is, critically important, and I think what you found at Netflix is that your audience is a little different, and that, I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but I think in future generations of your API, you maybe are making it a little bit harder for the developers to use in favor of efficiency, or is that an untrue statement?
Well, I'll characterize it a little differently.
Okay.
And what I will say is that the API that you can get to at developer.netflix.com is the public API. That is how it was originally conceptualized. Very REST-oriented. It offers XML and JSON, OAuth, all the stuff that you would typically get.
Most public APIs do, and we encourage.
Right.
I encourage.
Yeah, and that served Netflix quite well. But as I said before, the device penetration and the complexities of the scale have us steering in different directions. So recently we switched away from OAuth for internal devices. So we're understanding our audience, and our audience is generally people down the hall, right? And the people down the hall don't have the same restrictions or security breach opportunities or risks that the public might have.
You trust them with passwords.
We trust them more, and so we're going more with a cookie-based implementation. We can do those kinds of things because that is the audience, that is the interaction model, and we know those people very, very well. Similarly, we've been exploring pretty extensively in cutting against the REST model, which I think, I'm an advocate for REST. I think there are many use cases, but as I said, 800 devices, high degree of variability across what they can do, what their memory constraints are, or things like proprietary formats that are required, different XML, JSON hierarchical structures, CPU power, and that's going to impact things like, what can I deliver to them? Is this too meaty? Is it too much data? Is it too chatty? And so what we're doing is we're actually focusing more on how do we optimize for those devices to create the best user experience.
Yeah.
And that's the way we're shifting. And another way of characterizing it is that these devices in the REST world, we're asking all of these devices to adhere to our rules. And some of them might have to work kind of hard to adhere to those rules. And what we're trying to do at Netflix is say, how can we make it easier for them? And if it's harder on the API team or whoever else in these internal processes, it's going to be better for the customer. So how can we make it more optimal for them?
I see. So the API team is actually working hard to customize the API for the individual development groups using it.
We're working hard on thinking about how to be smart about it, right?
Yeah.
And so we're creating a platform for API development in essence. And I'll be talking more about this in the coming months as it really gets built out. And we have a fair amount up, and now it's all about the evangelism phase, and getting device adoption and things like that. But it's important to note that that's our audience. We're probably an exception. I don't know how many other companies have 800 plus devices out there that they
all
have to worry about.
Mostly,
or a good chunk.
Yeah.
It's all about understanding who your audience is, figuring out what technical challenges there are, and how to optimize for those.
Right.
Hey, API design is a really deep and fun topic, and if you're frustrated we're not spending enough time on that, there's a Google group that we participate in called API Craft. There's a link on the last slide, but you can just Google API Craft, and there's this great, rich community discussion. Check it out. As a product manager type, my consideration with design is thinking about making it easier for the customer, the developer, wherever they are, to get started, successful, fast. Nothing is worse than having a great API. And
right, because I know we're getting to the end, but I actually am going to digress for 1 sec. I think that what Daniel said is very interesting because it's about knowing your audience. And I think at Netflix they're realizing that one of the most valuable things for their audience is responsiveness.
Yeah.
So you want to have, one page on my device is one API call.
Yeah.
Not, 7 API calls because I've followed every tenet of REST and I'm making, So now REST can be efficient, but, sometimes you might have to take some shortcuts for the sense of efficiency. Generally speaking, my bias tends to be almost always towards making it easier for the developer unless you really, really are sure that you can take a shortcut. So generally speaking, whenever anyone asks me, what's a good API philosophy to use? Should I have hyperlinks in all of my APIs? Should all of my URLs be random numbers or whatever? I tend to really shy away from some of those approaches because they make it harder for the developer to build an app against the API. That's critically important for public APIs, but it's also important for private APIs because even inside your company, you may only have 20 developers inside your company, but if 19 of them look at your API and say, this is too hard to use, I'm going to build my own, well then, you failed. So, the audience for an API is a developer. And just as, user experience designers in 2012 are no longer allowed to say, it's harder to use, but, it's more efficient, so we're going to do it this way, which is not something you can ever say anymore in the user experience world. I think in the API design world, that same principle applies.
There's one other thing I want to say on that, and the Netflix scenario, there are lots of different teams who are building out device implementations on top of the API. And while it is important to try and improve performance and optimizations for the clients and ultimately for the customers, that's one component of our challenge. The other component is there's one pipeline that's delivering data to a lot of different teams. And to the extent that these different teams are putting demands on evolution, there becomes a bottleneck. And so then it's a prioritization question on what are we going to actually build and when, and are they able to innovate fast enough on those devices, and is the API able to help them do that, or are we becoming a bottleneck?
Yeah.
And so, again, this is a scale problem. As you get wider in your overall device world, it's harder to keep up with all the nuances there, and that's one of the considerations for us is improving the rate of innovation.
Cool. Yep. All right, so we're looking at about 10 minutes here, so this is a good topic, which is broad topic, but from a technology perspective, running a big platform or just designing a platform so that it could be running big traffic, what are some of the big animal considerations?
Yeah.
You own the business.
Can I just chime in before you go? Because I wanted to give you a lot of time for this. But again, this is all about audience, right? And so, for example, the first couple questions on the slide, how do you control the API traffic? For the Netflix case, controlling the traffic, of course, we don't want to get massive spikes that take down the system, which is not likely at this point. But who knows? But we have to put those safeguards in there. But rate limiting and things like that, that's not part of our consideration. So knowing your audience and knowing what kind of constraints you have is very important. So we keep pounding on that point, but it's a critical one.
No, but that is critically important. So we actually talk in the book about some of the different ways to control API traffic. So, for instance, having a circuit breaker, which is something that I know is on the Netflix platform as well as in many API platforms. Certainly, a circuit breaker that ops can actually control, like I don't know what's going on, we're going to switch this part of the API to read-only mode or something, or I don't know what's going on with this particular app, God forbid, maybe we shut it off, or maybe we shut off an IP address. Putting in rules like, if you see more than 1,000 requests a second from one IP address, at least raise an alert, if not limit that traffic. Those kinds of safety valves, I think, belong in every API program. Just as things like threat detection and validation of input. If you can put that in an API layer in front of the core app server code that you coded up, you have a layer of safety and security, because you're talking about accepting XML and JSON over the internet from devices that are in people's houses or cars or other countries. They can send you all kinds of interesting stuff. So those are some threats and I think some key things. We do talk a bit about quotas and SLAs and when does it make sense to have a strict rate limit by app or by user, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. A lot of APIs have that, and some maybe it's not appropriate. It may be appropriate to have, for instance, a per application quota of a certain number of API calls per day, but it may only be appropriate for app developers who are in the development phase. Maybe before they want to go live or put the app on the App Store or launch their app or whatever they're going to do, you want to give them an opportunity to contact you and say, please increase my rate limit. So there's a lot more about this in the book, and I think we've done some webinars and blogs on this in the past, and it's sounding to me like there's audience for even more discussion about some of these topics because we're running out of time.
Yeah. Actually, another thing that we talk about in the book, and I think we're running out of time here, so we can't really dig in, is...
Well, let me talk about the time here just real quick for the audience, which is we have two topics to cover, and the last one I can sum up in one sentence later. So we'll talk about security after this for 5 minutes, and then we'll be good. So go ahead. Don't rush. Dan.
Okay. So I was just going to bring up the idea of capturing metrics and understanding the uses, and we talk about that in the book a fair amount. And the way I like to think about it is typically the API is trying to improve your business. And so metrics around exclusively what's happening, like with a request and response for the API, is useful, particularly around system health and what's coming in. But ultimately, what you're looking for is how is this improving your business. And so trying to consider how you can trace what those requests and responses are translating into in terms of impressions and loyalty and things like that is a critical aspect. So,
an actual user, I think in the content chapter there's some stuff about something I don't tend to think about, which is I think the API is for the developer, so I want to know how much the app uses it. Well, if you're NPR or Netflix, you also need to know the content being delivered by the API. Where is that content going? Because that, for your marketing people, is really the gold. So can you put things in your API? Can you handle the image links in such a way so that API consumers can give you a little bit more analytics about actually who's viewing that content from the apps.
Absolutely. So beacons and things like that,
exactly.
that you can, or parameters on your URLs. Another interesting thing at NPR, for example, is if you know your assets, you can take advantage of them differently. And the NPR assets, there's text, there's images, there's all this other stuff. But a lot of people want to translate this into an audio experience. And so that audio experience is delivered similar to Netflix, through an external, basically through you, and it's not quite as portable, and you can do different things with that. You can track that differently. You can monetize that. You can put sponsorship on transactions, on individual transactions based on that user and their patterns. And so that can all be leveraged through the API if you're passing things around it correctly.
Yep. Okay, so we have about 2 minutes left, so let me have 2 slides left. The first is on a topic which could take an hour, which is security. Now, I'm going to say that since we probably won't be able to go deep here, I can't help but say that Greg published a free ebook last week on OAuth, which is a type of security that you can get on our blog. It's just for Kindle, so that if you want to go deep and you're frustrated, get that.
The Apigee blog.
But if I said, guys, 90 seconds, like big lessons learned in thinking about security, what do you think?
Big lessons learned. I mean, I think 2 are: 1, seriously, look into OAuth. It can solve a lot of OAuth 2 can solve a lot of authentication problems, even including the cookie-based, trusted device authentication problem that Daniel talked about. And second of all, don't neglect, threat detection. It's not just things like spike arresting and safety valves, but just validating that input. I mean, I've seen a lot of cases where, it never occurred to me that I have an API called validate password that could be called an infinite number of times. That's a great way to crack passwords on your system if you're not monitoring that. I think there are a lot of things like that I think it's probably time for another webinar and some more blogs on some of these topics.
Awesome. Dan, what do you think?
I agree. I'll point back to know your audience, right?
Yeah, so, that's the fundamental message.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are, a lot of developers do get frustrated with OAuth 1.0a, and sometimes
I feel that pain. Yes.
Sometimes it's a little more challenging, and if you have a very close-knit relationship with your developers, as is the Netflix case, maybe you don't need that heavy-handedness. Maybe you can do something else.
All right, last topic, and again, a frequent question is, I built the world's greatest API platform. How do I market it? I'm just going to sum it up in one sentence, which these guys have echoed, which is know your audience. And the way I think about it is, if you ask your product manager, or if you are the product manager, somebody asks you, who's the API for? And your answer is everybody, then that might be a sign of danger. Knowing your audience, as finely targeting as you can for a lot of reasons, which we talk about in the book. But again, it's the same messages over and over again. Go ahead.
No, we should wrap.
And then wrapping up, listen, thank you so much for your time. Thanks to O'Reilly. Got some links in here on the book, for the book, the free chapter. We've got an API design discussion group. We at Apigee have more like best practices, no product pitch webinars on YouTube. And tweet at me, and I'll send you a sticker if you love APIs. And
reach out to us individually if you want.
Absolutely.
We got a lot of great questions that we are going to answer and put on our blog, or work with O'Reilly to get up there. Stuff that we'll point you at, like monetization and choice of hosting providers, things we didn't get to, but we'll answer that and get back at you. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, folks, great webcast today. Thank you so much. If you do have a few minutes, folks, we do have several questions that came in, and our audience would love it if you could take a few.
We're happy to stay and answer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great.
Fantastic. Scott, can you see the questions in the Q&A? Awesome. Okay, we'll turn it back to you then.
Yeah. Listen, so Raghu asked about questions about monetization, and I almost put some slides in here, but I would business models for monetization. Programmable Web has some great charts which we put in the book, which I can post on the Q&A. That's kind of a hierarchy of different family trees, almost, of different monetization models. But I would say the vast majority of folks that we work with, Greg and I work with, monetize their API. They use their API to maximize distribution, and then they monetize of it just with a normal business model.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say the same, that the primary use case, particularly when we're talking about internal, is the API is supposed to enhance your business. If you sell financial reports, okay, well, the API helps you do that.
More financial reports,
yeah. If you offer streaming content, as does Netflix, okay, the API enables us to do that more. Now, as Scott mentioned in the programmable web diagram, there are other kinds of monetization opportunities, and when you get to the public opportunity, how are you going to, do you want an ad-supported model, or do you want to, pay per request, or, whatever else? I mean, they're all out there, and we talk about that in the book, but I think what we believe, or maybe it's just me, that we're trying to drive the internal use case and trying to maximize your business opportunity and letting APIs improve that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the APIs we're seeing at Apigee especially, we're seeing a lot of APIs that are, quote, free, which means that they essentially drive sales of products through other channels. A store locator API for a retailer. Well, you want to get people to come to the store, right? Another business model that I think is very interesting to think about is the one where, in addition to doing that, you pay developers a commission to build apps on your API. I think that is one surefire way to get more developer excitement about the API.
Yeah, like the contest model, right?
Yeah, or the contest model. And then finally, of course, you've got, if your service is so valuable in and of itself that you can charge, a penny an API call, great. I think there are businesses that can do that. I think that they may not be as many as they think.
Yeah, the challenge with some of that stuff, though, is, if you're charging for calls, what's your terms of use around caching, and if you're charging for that call and someone caches that, are you getting it for all the subsequent calls?
And you give refunds?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of...
Billing is not a fun problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, another question, hosting environments, cloud or build your own data center. Do you have any thoughts of, like, when you're running a large platform?
We have two poster boys for cloud in the room here. Yeah. I think that the cloud has gotten so powerful and ubiquitous and fast and scalable that, the economics of doing anything else become really daunting in my opinion. I mean, first of all, I don't think that in 2012 there are more than a handful of companies in the world that have their business even building data centers. Now, can you rent space from one of them? Yes, you can. But, unless you're doing, petabytes of data storage that requires, super high throughput I/O, there's so many great cloud options out there. Not just Amazon, but Amazon is clearly, every week they come out with something new that is valuable.
Yeah, so from the Netflix perspective, our implementation is in EC2.
Yes.
And if you go back to some of the metrics that I stated before, going from 600 million to 42 billion in 2 years, how many companies want to build out all of those boxes and have all the sysadmins spending all their time on upgrades and security patches? And, it's a huge cost to do that. Now, a lot of people are daunted by the expense of going into the cloud, and, that's an expense that's ongoing. But what opportunity are you sacrificing if you don't?
And how many people would you have had to hire to drive around to all the data centers, even if they're colos, and replace disk drives or hire people? I mean, it may not be a cost thing, it's also an agility thing. Yep. We've experienced the same thing at Apigee. We run a lot of our business in the cloud, and it's enabled us to grow very quickly. And when we have capacity problems, it's much, much easier to spin up new servers in the cloud than to, we're out of rack space. We need more power. Dell is not shipping very quickly this week, so we have to go to Fry's and buy some servers. I mean, we're just not worrying about that stuff, and that's a big advantage.
Yeah, the other thing is, for my business, Netflix streaming, we care about delivering an awesome international streaming product. Server maintenance and infrastructure it's an enabler for that, but it's not what we want our core competency to be. So we hand that off to Amazon and to the cloud, and our goal is to free up our internal resources to focus on the things that we care about.
And when we talk about the cloud, if you're talking about a small API, meaning you're not handling thousands of API calls or tens of thousands of API calls a second, Google App Engine, Microsoft Azure, Amazon Elastic Beanstalk, Heroku, Engine Yard, there are a lot of options out there that can very cost-effectively scale an API pretty impressively big without a lot of infrastructure. EC2 is not the only cloud option,
right.
And that's something to keep in mind. I mean, the ease of bringing up an API in one of the platforms like Heroku or App Engine, and have it scale. Yeah, if you do that, scalability is much less of a worry for you.
Let me ask you guys one last question, unless we get cut off, which is just taking myself back to who should read this book, and it's somebody who might need to run this business, right, or run the API program. And the topic is metrics, and the question I would have for both of you is what metrics should you think about to measure your program?
So for Netflix, we're trying to capture all metrics, and it's not about the API program. Again, we're capturing metrics that support the business.
Great.
The API is one mechanism that we use to capture that material, and it happens to be a good one for certain types of metrics because we're the front door. And, thousands or hundreds of devices, rather, are calling to us, and we are the central point for that, so we can capture that. But we're also calling out to a whole bunch of internal services to get metadata and have other internal dependency interactions. So all of us are basically handling capturing metrics, but it's all an effort to support our business model. Is this good for the streaming app? Is this A/B test resulting in worse performance for our users or better or whatever it is? We're basically capturing all of that, piping it into a system, and letting our business intelligence team deal with it. So as I said before, metrics around request response. It's interesting. It tells a little chunk of the story, and it talks. When I talk about numbers like 42 billion in a month, that shows the scale. It shows it shows some information. It shows that we're not going to tip over if we get to 50 billion. Those kinds of things, but it's not really helping the business to know that is the case.
As a matter of fact, it might be better for your business if it were 30 billion API calls a month, but they were driving more business, right? So, it's a hard problem to solve, but I think that if you're the API program leader or the API PM, that's one of your fundamental challenges is what, now you've got this API traffic flowing back and forth. It's usually in something like JSON that you can look at very efficiently. Without touching the existing back-end systems, you can look at that API traffic and extract information that helps you say exactly how much the API is helping the business. The challenge is, what is it that ties them together? And I think only you can figure that out.
Yeah, I agree. First, have them.
Yeah.
Secondly, agreeing with Daniel, imagine yourself walking into your senior executive's office, and imagine if they're going to want to hear about transactions. Probably not. They're probably going to want to hear about revenue or market share or customers. How
much your revenue has grown, or how much, since you got the API.
Absolutely.
Yeah, going back to that MPR diagram, I think that's a really useful diagram because what it shows is, yes, the API traffic has been growing. That diagram doesn't show it. But what people really care about is the fact that page view growth over a one-year span increased by 100%, and 80% of that traffic was a result of the API enabling device penetration and things like that. That is a really important metric, and that's important because you can take those page views and sell sponsorship and get money off of those, or do whatever your business is designed to do.
Well, listen, this might be a good point to say thank you again. I also want to say thank you to the many API program leaders we interviewed for our book, and say it's been fantastic working with O'Reilly. It's been fantastic working with you guys and Dan Woods, and thank you again for everybody for your time.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.